4 years after a democratically elected government was overthrown, Myanmar's state of emergency continues. Renewed for yet another 6 months, the junta says it's necessary in order to prepare elections they've pledged to hold this year. But with swathes of territory lost to opposing forces and a deposed government still imprisoned or in exile, would an election usher in democracy or reinforce the military's grip? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Myanmar. Multiple extensions of Myanmar's state of emergency have lent the junta extraordinary power to fight the forces who've risen up against it. But in spite of suspending constitutional law for a 7th time, Myanmar's military seems to be losing ever more power and land. Still, they've pledged to hold elections in 2025, even while many analysts say it would be almost impossible to provide any of the conditions for a democratic poll. So what is the state of Myanmar? And will anything fundamentally change in the year to come? Here's a look.
Myanmar's junta is struggling to survive and legitimize its rule 4 years after it seized power in a coup. On Friday, the military extended the state of emergency for another 6 months, claiming that it is necessary to facilitate the holding of elections.
There are still more tasks to be done to hold the general election successfully, especially for a free and fair election. Stability and peace is still needed.
The junta previously announced that it will hold elections this year and has conducted a census in preparation. Yet opposition groups described the polls as a sham to extend the military rule. A joint offensive by rebel groups known as the Three Brotherhood Alliance has put the junta's grip on power to a major test. They have captured key border areas and drawn closer to the country's second largest city, Mandalay. But last week, China said it had brokered a ceasefire between the military government and one of the groups in the rebel alliance, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army.
China firmly opposes war and chaos in Myanmar. It hopes that all parties will maintain the momentum of ceasefire and talks, earnestly implement the consensus reached, take the initiative to ease the situation on the ground, and further negotiate and resolve relevant issues through dialogue.
China has the most leverage over the military and the rebels. It has been unhappy about the online scam centres operating on its southern border with Myanmar and urged the junta to take action. Myanmar's civil war has also hampered China's trade throughout the country. Yet only one group has ceased fighting, while the army continues to clash with various rebel groups. The regional bloc, ASEAN, urged the junta to prioritise peace over elections.
Yeah, they're prepared. They are suggesting they're going to have an election, but we said election have to be inclusive. Election cannot be in isolation. See? It has to be involve all segment of stakeholders. But if you want to have a election on isolation only represent certain quarters of this sector in segment in Myanmar, I don't think that is the priority. Their priority now is stop the violence.
ASEAN has often been criticised for its ineffectiveness in solving Myanmar's crisis. Some believe its attempts could improve under the recent chairmanship of Malaysia. It brought Myanmar to the group in 1997. ASEAN has already appointed former Malaysian diplomat Othman Hashim as special envoy to the country. And Malaysia's foreign minister said ASEAN has no intention to remove Myanmar from the bloc and is determined to continue dialogue. Years-long instability has brought the country's population to its knees. The UN says the country's GDP has shrunk 9% and inflation has reached over 25%. The conflict has displaced 3.5 million people within the country, and many are without basic necessities.
The coming year will test Myanmar's resilience to its limits as it navigates the numerous challenges of this prolonged polycrisis. The international community must adapt its support strategies accordingly, prioritizing limited resources to mitigate the most severe regressions while building community resilience to ongoing and inevitable future shocks.
So far, attempts to pressure the military rulers have failed, with many opposition leaders either in jail or exile, and the growing destruction of a civil war, Myanmar appears to be further than ever from democratic rule.
Now, ASEAN leaders have told Myanmar's generals to make peace a priority rather than an election. But is either one actually possible if the junta stays in power? Joining me now to debate that and more are the executive director of Burma Human Rights Network, Kyaw Win, from Kuala Lumpur, co-chair of ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, Charles Santiago, and from Kent, UK, co-founder of the Forces of Renewal Southeast Asia, Maung Zarni. Thanks all so much for being with me. So, no surprise that the state of emergency has been extended yet again, but I guess what's more difficult to understand are the military's real intentions toward holding an election. So, Maung, I'll start with you. Would it ever be possible to hold any sort of credible election this year? And does extending the state of emergency kind of help or hinder creating the conditions for an actual vote?
Andrea, the key word is credible. I think, of course, it's possible to hold elections. Whether the elections will serve as a vehicle for political stability and peace is another matter. But the issue here is that China, the most influential external actor in the Burmese or Myanmar's context, is keen on restoring some semblance of political stability in about half the towns and cities that the military junta still controls. And then the ASEAN is rightly pushing for peace, and which I agree completely. So you've got a situation where the most powerful actor thinks that the election, however flawed and least or less credible, is the way to go. ASEAN thinks that it is peace that must come before the elections. But the most crucial thing for the Burmese people is to stop this multi-front internal military conflict, whether you want to call it a revolutionary wars or civil war. The key is for the people to have this respite.
Okay. Kyaw Win, there's a lot I'd like to talk about, but let's just stick to the intention to hold an election, even if it is considered a sham by most, observers. What or whom would an election actually consist of at this point, if the military kind of forces it through, and if China, as Maung Zarni was saying, backs it?
Thanks for having me today. I totally agree with my previous speaker, Dr. Kozani, and I think even it's at some point the idea of election organizing, planning for the elections, it doesn't make sense because many locations in many towns and cities are not under the control of the military right now. There are many towns and cities still under their control as well. So how could this election will represent the whole Burma? That's the first question. And the second question is, there are civil wars going on and the civilian villages has been bombed. There are more than 3 million displaced now. How could this election will represent these IDPs? So there are many questions as Kozani has earlier questioned that the credibility is the most important thing. Now, how could this election will be credible? And the pushing for this election, it is not only that this is not only disregarding the aspiration of the people of Burma, it is also helping this military junta, the criminal regime, the genociders, to cement the authorities and their power.
Right.
Which is,
but that's exactly why they want to hold an election. Even if it's not seen as credible from within, as long as they're holding the power, they can simply claim an election has been held and they won. We've seen this happen countless times around the world. So do you fear that they will just force an election through to give the illusion of legitimacy?
I think they will. This is what they are going to do, and that's what they are selling, and they are doing heavily marketing about this. But what is the problem here is China is willing to buy this kind of fake elections or sham elections, but the real people who are on the ground, their aspirations and their democratic rights are now every day bombed by fighter jets and artillery shellings and using drones. So this is impossible to have a proper genuine elections. So absolutely, the international community must come out with their stronger objection of this election. This shouldn't be. This is a
Right.
hook, they try to catch the fish.
We'll talk more about what the international community can actually do at this point. But let me move on to Charles, because we were speaking about ASEAN and what can realistically and should realistically ASEAN do, especially with Malaysia right now at the helm. Kuala Lumpur has been very frustrated with, for example, the influx of Rohingya refugees, and that's not likely going to get better for Malaysia under the military, nor if the Arakan army take more territory, which is what the military is fighting right now. So where is ASEAN's position re-Malaysia now?
Let me quickly respond to your first question and then try to link it to your question that you just raised. I think the idea of an election is largely coming from China. And that is, the purpose of that is to create a sense of legitimacy for the existing regime. That is the Min Aung Hlaing regime. And also a way of protecting China's investments in the country. China knows very well the rate things are going. The Min Aung Hlaing's regime has come under enormous attack, and they've lost lots of ground. And most importantly, they have lost all sense of legitimacy, both in the country as well as in ASEAN. So China is asserting itself and telling Min Aung Hlaing, you have to have these elections to show that you have some support in the country, though. Now, this ASEAN has said very clearly in the last 2 weeks ago, when the ASEAN foreign ministers met, they said, no way we will accept the elections in Beijing, in Myanmar. And what we need to now is to look at the political dialogue, the political process. Now, coming back to the issue of refugees that are coming to not only to Thailand, but also to Malaysia as well as to Aceh, I think this is part of the 5-point consensus that has been put forward by the ASEAN governments 4 years ago, and now we're heading to a 5th year. And clearly, there is a recognition or a general perception that the entire 5-point consensus has not worked, and there's a need to rethink and redefine 5-point consensus on the basis of the failure of the last 4 or 5 years. So one of the ways to look at the refugee problem is to actually look at a humanitarian fund, an ASEAN mooted an ASEAN humanitarian fund that will be supported by all of ASEAN governments, together with partners like Australia, Japan, Korea, US, Europe, and so on and so forth. Maybe Europe now with America, with Trump, it might be a bit difficult process, but other countries can support it. The whole point is that for the refugees problem to be, the ownership of the refugee problem and the humanitarian aid will come under ASEAN.
Okay.
This is really quite important.
But
because right now,
interestingly, though, you had also said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a bit of an issue with ASEAN having to appoint or have Kuala Lumpur appoint a special envoy from Malaysia, being a Malaysian special envoy for ASEAN. Could that complicate what you think is best for an ASEAN approach here?
I think, after the 4 years of seeing the way the ASEAN 5-point consensus has been put forward, I think it is time to rethink the role of the envoy. The envoy cannot be the special envoy of the chair of ASEAN at every year. What we need is an ASEAN special envoy, which is a big difference because every 8 months you change country from one country to the other. Prior to this, it was Laos, and before Laos is Indonesia. So that particular country only has about a good 8 to 9 months to do its work. And in the case of Indonesia, they had about 164 different consultations with all stakeholders, which was a good thing. But when it came to Laos, nobody knew what was happening. And in 8 months, you really cannot do much. That's the point I want to make, though.
Okay.
But if you have an ASEAN special envoy who works round the clock over the years and over the months and years, you will see some progress. Here, you will have Malaysia taking over, and 2 weeks ago, a new special envoy was appointed, and his mandate will go up to October, because come October, you will have to hand it over to somebody else, to the Philippines this time. So you only have 8 months, which you can't do very much. And the problem here is this: the longer you keep going with this, you only support the regime and the junta in Myanmar. This has to stop.
Okay.
That is why it is important to rethink the 5-point consensus.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I agree with my friend Charles. Assessment of ASEAN 5-point consensus and how it has not produced any intended outcome, which is stability and the political process. And also I would take a different perspective on the question of legitimacy. Of course, we have the genocidal regime that committed, a textbook example of a genocide against the Rohingya people and adopted Islamophobia as against all other Myanmar Muslims. And so, this regime will remain lacking legitimacy. But I think I take a different approach here because we need to start looking at the cost of continuing civil war. It didn't happen 4 years ago. We have been in civil war for at least 2 generations. And so I think if we reshift the focus from the democratic deficit of legitimacy to the future of the country and the well-being of the entire Myanmar society, including rank-and-file soldiers of the junta, as well as the democratic forces and armed ethnic revolution, that might lead us to some kind of opening where we can bring pro-election China and pro-election ASEAN into a framework of let's focus on what the Burmese people need as a society, as a country.
Okay.
So I think that the conversation should start there because we're going to have this diametrically opposing position on number one, legitimacy of the regime. China thinks that this is the only central organization that can hold at least half the country under its military control, and ASEAN wants to, or ASEAN talks about democracy. ASEAN is not exactly a club of Democrats.
The perfect model, yeah. Well, let me ask Kyaw Win then, because if you want to talk about the future of the country and what Myanmar's people actually want, there is an issue of the potential Balkanization that many have been talking about of Myanmar, because there are too many rebel groups in particular that are looking for either far more autonomy, if not even independence, within Myanmar. And there's not just one or two, there are many factions. Do you think it's realistic to talk about looking at a greater good approach at this point that ASEAN and China could support? I mean, where do you see Myanmar's public going, especially over the course of this year to come? Will they find unity, or do you think there's further fracturing ahead?
What I'm seeing right now is mostly the big powers like China, like Western powers, like India, like ASEAN. In one another way, they are disregarding the aspiration of the people of Burma, especially China and other countries. What I'm saying, India, including India. So Western countries supporting the people aspirations, but also that need to support to the end, not just cutting down on the halfway. While now we have so much problems, refugee problems, and people who lost their limbs and they have no hospital right now. So this is a current situation we are facing. But the point is, organically, people come together when the revolution, the military coup happened. So young people who shelter in the ethnic and control areas, and then the NUG has come out with some solutions, the formations of the exile government. But the most important thing here is every ethnic group has their own territory, and they respect each other, their own territory. But also there is some clashes. But this clash is not something we cannot solve on the table. There need to be a federal government. All aspiration of the people of Burma is to have a federal democratic country, and each and every ethnic group, minority groups are also looking for example, Muslim minority. There are 6 different ethnic Muslim groups in Burma, from north to south, from east to west. But this Muslim population are not only lost their ethnicity rights, they also lost their citizenship rights. They are now become stateless. They are being targeted, as Dr. Maung Zarni earlier said. Burma is practicing since 1960 institutionalized Islamophobia. So this is so much dangerous. That's how the end with the genocide. So in order to say that unifying things, we need to have some central government, that central committee that to unify. I mean, there are so many pros and cons what we are seeing right now. It would be unrealistic to say that, okay, yes, we are all united. No, there are some troubles, there are some practical problem we have, but this can be solved against the military when the military once fall. There will be some agreement, there will be some kind of understanding.
Okay. Let me come back to Charles, because we can look at perhaps what the international community can do, whether it's via ASEAN or not. I mean, you've spoken about an ASEAN humanitarian fund. That could be a very interesting approach to at least address some of the issues. But if China is really the power broker here, is it about China either supporting the junta directly, or is it just protecting its own interests, investments, and security that happens to work in favor of the junta at this point, so that China can be swayed either way that would just represent, for whatever best represents China's interest?
I think the relationship between China and Myanmar, especially with the army, goes back a long way. For the 50, 60 years. I mean, it's a long relationship between the generals. They know each other, and they peddle drugs, they peddle all kinds of stuff within each other, arms and so on and so forth. So therefore, the relationship is an old one, and also it's also opportunistic in the case of China, because China has huge amounts of investments in Myanmar, and I think they do not want to compromise those investments. So I think this is something that is a stumbling block for any way forward, because China has made its position very clear that they are with Min Aung Hlaing, and they will do his bidding. Now, this is where ASEAN could play a brokering role in the context of the 5-point consensus. See, the first point in the 5-point consensus is actually to talk about political dialogue. Political dialogue, meaning the dialogue between all parties, not only with the government, but with all parties, including the resistance groups and so on and so forth. I think it is time for ASEAN to bring on board the NUG, NUCC, the ethnic organizations and other organizations to the table for further discussion. And it should be done openly. Indonesia had a very interesting experience where they met with them, closed doors. But I think the time for closed doors is over, because after 4 years of failing, failing in the 5-point consensus, it is time to say, hey, look, we need to up the game. We need to go the next level, which is to talk to all of the parties openly. I think this is the way forward to solve that problem.
Okay.
I think the other problem is this: if ASEAN doesn't solve this soon enough, then ASEAN's own credibility is at stake. And this is something that ASEAN
has been in question at a number of points now. But let me ask Maung Zarni about that. I mean, could you foresee ASEAN doing that, actually bringing in opposition parties in Myanmar to look for peace with all parties involved, rather than just identifying one government for Myanmar and that being the military junta? Would that ever be a possibility? Because it does sound like a sincere step toward dialogue and peace.
think Charles was right when he said, there has to be dialogue with all, stakeholders currently in conflict, including the central military. But the only problem is twofold. Inside Myanmar, within the anti-junta armed revolutionary and resistant forces, do not have a unified ideological commitment or the organizational front. And on the other hand, externally, the Asian actors who are more important in Burma than the Western governments that pay lip service to human rights. If you look at what their position is on Palestine vis-a-vis Myanmar, we can see the hypocrisy here. So I wouldn't factor in the West too much in the way the Burmese issue is addressed. And so there should be also not just the ASEAN consensus. There should be an Asia-wide comprehensive understanding of the situation. If we can get those two things together, external and internal comprehensive positions of different actors, then I think that we can move the Burma issue forward. Otherwise, we're going to be going in a circle.
Maung Zarni, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmaker. Very unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for joining me. Great to have you all, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.